What happens when the world's most invisible person finally decides to be seen? We've all been there, ignored, overlooked, judged by our job title or the clothes we wear. For 24-year-old Ilara Vance, being invisible was a survival tactic. A waitress at one of the city's most luxurious restaurants, she was just a ghost floating between tables of the rich and powerful. But one night, one family, the notoriously cruel Vaneirs dynasty, decided to make her their sport. They pushed her, mocked her, and tried to break her spirit. They thought she was just a waitress. They had no idea they were trying to silence a songbird who was about to bring their world crashing down with a single note. The Aria Grandeur wasn't just a restaurant, it was a theatre. Every night a play unfolded on its marble-floored stage, starring the city's elite. The set was dressed in cascading crystal chandeliers, tables draped in heavy Belgian linen and silverware that cost more than a month's rent. The air hummed with the quiet confidence of old money and the loud proclamations of the new. And in this theatre, Ilara Vance was a stagehand, a ghost in the wings, essential but unseen. At 24, Ilara wore her waitress uniform like a suit of armor and an invisibility cloak all in one. The crisp black apron, the starched white shirt, the sensible non-slip shoes, they were her camouflage. Her movements were economical and precise, honed by years of practice. She could navigate a crowded floor with a tray laden with delicate champagne flutes without spilling a drop, her face a mask of polite neutrality. She could anticipate a diner's need for a water refill from across the room, sense the subtle shift in mood that signaled they were ready for the check, and disappear the moment she was no longer needed. Most patrons treated her as she appeared a functional part of the restaurant's machinery. A polite nod, a murmured, "Thank you," a dismissive wave. It was a transactional relationship she had come to accept. It paid the bills. More importantly, it paid for the mountain of medical expenses for her mother, whose fragile lungs were in a constant losing battle with fibrosis. That reality was the anchor that kept Ilara grounded, enduring the long hours, the aching feet, and the occasional condescending guest. Tonight, however, was different. A palpable tension had settled over the staff from the moment the reservation was confirmed. Vaneirs Table 7, 8 p.m. The manager, Mr. Dubois, had announced, his voice tight. "Sharpest uniforms, no mistakes, you know the drill." Everyone knew the drill. The Vaneirs family was Aria Grandeur's most prestigious and most dreaded client. Richard Vaneirs was a titan of finance, a man whose corporate takeovers were as brutal as they were legendary. His wife, Beatrice, was a queen of high society, a woman whose charity work was eclipsed only by her famously sharp tongue and icy demeanor. Their two children, 25-year-old Julian and 22-year-old Serafina, had inherited their parents' sense of entitlement as if it were a genetic trait. Ilara's heart sank when Mr. Dubois assigned her their section. "Vance, you're the best we have. Stay calm, stay professional. Don't let them get to you." It was meant as a compliment, but it felt like a sentence. At precisely 8:02 p.m. they arrived. Richard, broad-shouldered in a bespoke navy suit, surveyed the room as if he were considering a hostile acquisition. Beatrice, draped in diamonds that glittered like shards of ice, swept past the hostess without a word, her gaze fixed on the prime corner table. Julian, with a smug, practiced smirk, sauntered behind, scrolling on his phone. Serafina followed, already pouting her designer dress, looking more like a costume for a social media post than an outfit for dinner. Ilara approached the table, her notepad in hand, the familiar professional smile fixed on her lips. "Good evening, and welcome to Aria Grandeur. My name is Ilara, and I will be your server tonight. May I start you with some water? We have still or sparkling." Beatrice didn't even look at her. She was busy adjusting her diamond bracelet. We'll have a bottle of the Chateau Margaux, the 05, and make sure it's decanted properly this time. The last time we were here, the sommelier was an amateur." "Of course, Mrs. Vandermeer," Ilara said, making a note. She turned her attention to the others. "And for you," Richard grunted, still scanning the room. Julian finally looked up from his phone, his eyes flicking over Ilara's uniform with a dismissive air. "Just get the wine. We'll tell you when we need you." His tone implied she was a faulty appliance to be summoned at will. Serafina let out an exaggerated sigh. "And can you please tell the pianist to play something less funereal? It's like we're at a wake." The pianist, a gentle elderly man named Arthur, was playing a soft classical melody. Ilara offered a tight-lipped nod. "I will pass along the message." She retreated from the table, her back straight, her steps measured, but beneath the calm exterior, a familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. It wasn't just their rudeness, it was the way they looked through her as if she were less than human, a mere collection of functions designed for their convenience. She relayed the wine order to the sommelier, who grimaced at the memory of his last encounter with the Vandermeers. As she collected the water glasses, she could hear their conversation, their voices carrying easily across the hushed restaurant. "Honestly, Richard, must we come here?" Beatrice was saying. "The service gets worse every time. Look at that waitress, not an ounce of personality." "It's about being seen, darling," Richard replied, his voice a low rumble. "Marcus Thorne is dining here tonight. I need to close the Soundverse media deal with him. A little public schmoozing." Ilara's breath caught in her throat. Marcus Thorne, the legendary music producer, the man who had discovered dozens of stars. He was her father's oldest and dearest friend, or he had been before the accident, before everything fell apart. She remembered Marcus from her childhood, a warm, boisterous man with a laugh that could shake a room. He used to come over for dinner listening, as her father, David Vance, a brilliant but commercially unsuccessful composer, played new pieces on their worn, upright piano. Marcus had always believed in her father's genius. He'd also always told a young Ilara, perched on the piano bench beside her dad, "You have the voice of an angel, kiddo. Don't you ever let anyone silence it." After her father's fatal car crash 5 years ago, everything had changed. The mountain of debt he'd left behind, a result of a catastrophic business deal with a shark who'd stolen his publishing rights, had swallowed their lives whole. Marcus had reached out, but Ilara's mother, lost in her grief, had pushed everyone away. They had moved, downsized, and slowly faded from that world. Ilara hadn't seen or spoken to Marcus Thorne in 5 years, and now he was here, in the same room. She glanced across the restaurant and saw him at a secluded table deep in conversation. He looked older, his hair now more silver than black, but it was unmistakably him. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her, a deep, aching nostalgia for a life that was gone, and a sharp, bitter shame for the life she was living now. She took a deep, steadying breath, picked up her tray with the chilled water, and walked back towards table 7. The armor was back in place. The ghost was ready to resume her duties. But for the first time in a long time, she was acutely aware of the girl hiding underneath the uniform, the girl who once had a voice. The appetizers were served, and the Vandermeers' campaign of casual cruelty escalated. Every interaction was a microaggression, a subtle jab designed to remind Ilara of her station. When she poured the decanted Chateau Margaux, Julian watched her every move, his lip curled in a sneer. "Careful now," he said, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "That bottle costs more than your monthly salary. It would be a shame to waste it." Ilara's hand didn't tremble. She finished the pour with perfect precision, placing the bottle back on the table with a soft click. "Enjoy your wine, sir," she said, her voice even. Beatrice, however, was just warming up. She took a delicate bite of her seared foie gras. "This is barely acceptable," she announced to her husband, but her cold eyes were fixed on Elara. "Tell the chef the fig reduction is overly sweet. A competent kitchen would know the balance." "My apologies, madam. I will inform the chef immediately." Elara replied, her professional smile feeling like a hardening mask. As she turned to leave, Serafina, who was trying to capture the perfect photo of her caviar for her Instagram story, stuck her foot out, ever so slightly. It was a petulant, almost childish move, but effective. Elara, not expecting the obstruction, stumbled. The tray in her hand, holding only a water pitcher, tilted precariously. With a surge of adrenaline, she managed to right it before it fell, but a small splash of ice water arced through the air, landing directly on the sleeve of Julian's custom-tailored jacket. The silence at the table was instantaneous and deadly. Julian shot up from his seat, looking at the damp spot on his sleeve, as if he'd been splashed with acid. "You clumsy idiot!" he hissed, his face contorting with rage. "This is Zegna. Do you have any idea what this costs?" "I am so terribly sorry," Elara stammered, her composure finally cracking. She reached for a napkin, but Beatrice slapped her hand away. "Don't you dare touch him." Beatrice's voice was a venomous whisper, but it cut through the restaurant's ambiance like a knife. "You are an incompetent, useless girl. Look what you've done." Serafina was now recording the entire incident on her phone, a small, malicious smile playing on her lips. "OMG, you guys, the help here is literally the worst," she narrated quietly to her followers. Mr. Dubois rushed over his face, pale. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Vandermeer?" Richard finally spoke, his voice low and menacing. He didn't look at Elara, but addressed the manager as if she weren't there. "Your staff is a liability, Dubois. This girl just assaulted my son. I want her fired. Now." The word assaulted hung in the air, absurd and poisonous. Elara stood frozen, her heart pounding against her ribs. Fired. She couldn't be fired. Her mother's next round of medication was due. The rent was already late. A black spot danced in her vision. I am so sorry, it was an accident," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "I tripped." "Lies," Julian spat. "She's been glaring at us all night. This was intentional." Mr. Dubois looked from the furious faces of the Vandermeers to Elara's terrified one. He was a decent man, trapped in an impossible position. He knew the Vandermeers were his most important clients, and Richard Vandermeer was a man who could ruin him with a single phone call. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice strained with regret, "please go to my office. We will discuss this." It was a death sentence. Discussing it meant waiting while he placated the family, and then being quietly let go with a week's severance, if she was lucky. The walk to the manager's office felt like a walk to the gallows. She could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant on her back, pity from some, contempt from others. She risked a glance over at Marcus Thorne's table. He was looking their way, a deep frown creasing his brow. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in his, she saw a flicker of recognition, confusion. Before she could process it, she was through the doors to the back of the house. Inside the sterile, windowless office, the minutes stretched into an eternity. She could hear the muffled sounds of the restaurant outside, a world from which she had just been ejected. She sat on a hard plastic chair, her hands twisting in her lap. The humiliation burned in her cheeks. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the utter degradation. They hadn't just been rude, they had sought to annihilate her dignity, to erase her personhood for their own fleeting amusement. She thought of her father. He had been a man of immense talent and even greater humility. He treated everyone from concertmasters to janitors with the same gentle respect. He used to tell her, "Elara, your voice is a gift, but your character is a choice. Always choose kindness." Where was the kindness now? In this world of Xenia suits and casual cruelty, kindness was a weakness to be exploited. After what felt like a lifetime, Mr. Dubois came in his shoulders slumped. "Elara, I'm sorry," he began. "They are insistent. Mr. Vandermeer threatened to pull his corporate account. That's half our weekly revenue. I have no choice." The words hit her, but she felt strangely numb. The fight had gone out of her. "I understand," she said, her voice flat. "Look," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Go home for tonight. Let me see if I can smooth this over. Maybe after they've left, I can convince him to drop it. Just lay low." It was a flimsy offer, a desperate attempt to soften the blow, and they both knew it. As she stood up to leave, a wave of defiant anger, hot and sharp, suddenly pierced through her numbness. She had apologized. She had groveled. She had endured their insults and their contempt. And for what to be thrown away like a piece of trash over a few drops of water? The memory of Marcus Thorne's words from her childhood echoed in her mind. "Don't you ever let anyone silence you." For 5 years she had been silent. She had silenced herself, burying her talent, her passion, her very identity under a mountain of grief and obligation. She had let the world turn her into a ghost, and the Vandermeers. They weren't just patrons. They were a symbol of the very force that had destroyed her family, the faceless, powerful greed that had chewed up her father's dreams and left them with nothing. She didn't know the specifics of her father's ruin, only that he had been outmaneuvered by a corporate predator in a deal for his music catalogue. Richard Vandermeer was the quintessential corporate predator. Something inside her snapped. "Mr. Dubois," she said, her voice clear and steady, now devoid of its earlier tremor. "Before I go, there's something I have to do." He looked at her, surprised by her sudden change in demeanor. "What is it?" "The pianist," she said. "Serafina Vandermeer complained about his music. He looks tired tonight. I'd like to offer a replacement for one song." Mr. Dubois stared at her, utterly bewildered. "Elara, this is hardly the time for jokes. Just go home." "I'm not joking," she said, untying the strings of her apron. She folded it neatly and placed it on his desk. "I'm done being invisible." Before he could react, she turned and walked out of his office, not towards the back exit, but straight back into the heart of the restaurant. Elara walked through the swinging kitchen doors and back into the main dining room. The hum of conversation, which had momentarily dipped during the earlier confrontation, had returned to its normal level. The Vandermeers were back to their meal, looking smug and victorious. Julian was dabbing at his sleeve with a napkin, a smirk of satisfaction on his face. They had won. They had swatted the fly, and their world was back in order. They didn't see her coming. Nobody did. A waitress without her apron and tray was just another person, momentarily out of place. Her target was the baby grand piano, gleaming under the soft spotlights on a slightly raised dais in the center of the room. Arthur, the elderly pianist, was just finishing his set. He played the final chord of a Chopin nocturne, and a smattering of polite applause followed. He looked drained, the Vandermeers' earlier complaint having clearly taken its toll on his confidence. As he rose slowly from the bench to take his break, Elara intercepted him. "Arthur," she said softly. He looked at her, his kind eyes clouded with worry. "Elara, my dear, I heard what happened. I'm so sorry. Those people are vipers." "It's all right, Arthur," she said, a strange calm settling over her. "Would you mind if I took your place just for one song?" Arthur blinked, confused. But..." "I didn't know you played." "There's a lot people don't know," she replied, a faint, mysterious smile on her lips. "Please. Just one." He saw the look in her eyes, not of pleading, but of unshakable resolve. He hesitated for a moment, then gave a small, conspiratorial nod. "Be my guest." He stepped aside, and Elara walked the final few feet to the piano. She slid onto the polished leather bench. The keys were cool and smooth beneath her fingertips like old friends she hadn't touched in years. The muscle memory was instant. Her hands, which had spent years carrying trays and polishing glasses, remembered the weight and feel of an F-sharp minor chord, the delicate dance of a melody. A hush began to fall over the tables closest to the dais. People were noticing. A waitress, still in her uniform trousers and white shirt, but stripped of her apron, was sitting at the piano. Whispers rippled through the room. "Who is that?" "Is this part of the entertainment?" Mr. Dubois emerged from the back, his face a mask of horror. He started towards her, his mouth open to call her name, to stop the impending catastrophe. At table 7, Serafina was the first to notice. "Oh my God," she snickered, raising her phone again. "The crazy waitress is back. Is she going to play chopsticks for us?" Julian laughed cruelly. "Maybe it's her official resignation, a musical one. How pathetic." Beatrice looked on with pure disdain. "Dubois had better handle this, or we are never coming back." Richard, however, was watching with a flicker of curiosity. He recognized the look on Elara's face. It wasn't desperation. It was determination. It was the look of an adversary, not a victim. Elara ignored them all. She ignored the whispers, the stares, the manager frozen in his tracks. She looked across the room, her gaze finding Marcus Thorne. He was watching her intently now. His conversation abandoned, his head tilted with a look of profound curiosity. She gave him the slightest, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of a past he couldn't possibly know he was a part of. Then she closed her eyes. She took one deep breath, clearing her mind of everything but the music. She wasn't Elara, the waitress, anymore. She wasn't the grieving daughter or the struggling caregiver. In this moment, she was just a voice waiting to be released. She placed her fingers on the keys, and the first notes filled the stunned silence of the aria grandeur. It wasn't a well-known classical piece or a peppy jazz standard. The melody that flowed from her fingers was haunting, melancholic, and intensely personal. It was a melody her father had written years ago, an unfinished symphony that had been his life's work. It was a piece no one outside their family had ever heard. And then she opened her mouth and began to sing. Elara's voice was not what anyone expected. It was not the soft, hesitant whisper of a timid waitress. It was a force of nature. It was a sound born of loss and resilience, of smouldering anger and heartbreaking love. It was a voice that was technically perfect, but emotionally raw, a rich, soulful alto that seemed to physically press against the air in the room, demanding to be heard. The lyrics were her own, written in stolen moments, in a dog-eared notebook, words she never thought she'd sing aloud. Music begins, a haunting, powerful piano intro. You see the apron and the tired eyes. You see a ghost that you can criticize. You build your castles on a fragile ground. And I'm the silence. I'm the background sound. The opening lines struck the room like a thunderclap. Every conversation stopped. Forks froze midway to mouths. At table 7, the smirks on Julian's and Serafina's faces vanished, replaced by slack-jawed disbelief. Beatrice's perfectly manicured hand paused on its way to her wine glass. She was staring at Elara, her cold composure finally cracking. Elara's voice swelled, filling every corner of the vast dining room. It was a voice that didn't just carry. it enveloped. Her hands moved over the piano keys with a fluid grace that spoke of a lifetime of practice, the complex chords and arpeggios of her father's music pouring out of her as if from a primal source. You spill your cruelty like it's vintage wine, you draw your borders and you call them mine. But in the shadows where you made me stay, a different kind of fire learned the way to play. The song was an accusation, a lament and a declaration of war all at once. It was aimed squarely at the Vaneirs, but it resonated with everyone who had ever felt small, dismissed or judged. The other servers stood motionless along the walls, their faces a mixture of awe and dawning pride. Mr. Dubois had stopped in his tracks, his managerial panic replaced by sheer, unadulterated astonishment. Across the room, Marcus Thorne leaned forward, his eyes wide. The melody? It was so familiar. It was David Vance's style, his unique harmonic signature. But there was something more, something new. And the girl's voice. He squinted, trying to place her. The face was older, etched with a sadness he hadn't known, but the eyes, the shape of her face. It couldn't be. Could it? The song built to its chorus, and Ilara's voice soared, shedding its melancholic husk to reveal a core of pure, unyielding power. But I am not the name you call. I am the writing on the wall. And this one voice you tried to break is the one earthquake that you can't unmake. So listen, now the quiet's done. My stage is here. My song's begun. The power of the final note vibrated through the crystal glasses. It was a sound of absolute defiance. She was no longer looking down at the keys. Her eyes were open, and she was looking directly at table 7. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a performer holding an entire room of the city's most powerful people in the palm of her hand. Richard Vandermeer was completely still, his face unreadable, but his eyes betraying a deep, unsettling shock. He was a man who controlled every room he was in, who bent the world to his will. And he was being held captive by the song of a waitress he had tried to have fired moments before. The song shifted the melody, softening into a bridge of heartbreaking beauty. It spoke of a lost father, of shattered dreams, of a legacy buried but not forgotten. He gave me music. He gave me soul, a broken story to be made whole. You took the pages, you tore the art, but you could never, ever steal the heart. At his table, Marcus Thorne's breath hitched. David's girl, he whispered to himself, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. It was her. It was little Ilara Vance, all grown up. The girl with the voice of an angel. He remembered her father's music, the stolen catalogue, the mystery surrounding the predator who had ruined him. A cold dread mingled with a rising fury began to creep into his heart. As the song reached its final climactic verse, Ilara stood up from the piano bench, her hand grabbing the nearby microphone from its stand, a prop for the weekend jazz trio that she now claimed as her own. She stepped forward away from the piano, her voice needing no amplification, but using the microphone as a final symbolic act of seizing power. So go on, judge me by my dirty shoes. Tell all your friends about your awful news. That one small waitress with nothing to her name just lit a fire and screamed into the flame. I am not the name you call. I am the writing on the wall. She held the final, soaring note, pouring every ounce of her pain, her anger, and her hope into it. It was a note of pure, cathartic release, a primal scream polished into a thing of terrifying beauty. It hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, a shimmering, defiant banner of sound. Then she fell silent. The silence that followed was absolute. It was deeper and more profound than any quiet the aria grandeur had ever known. No clinking forks, no whispers, No rustling of clothes. There was only the sound of 100 people holding their collective breath, their minds reeling from what they had just witnessed. The ghost had just proven she was the most solid thing in the room. The background noise had become the main event, and the Vandermeer family, for the first time in their privileged lives, were utterly, completely, and magnificently dumbfounded. The stunned silence held for 3 long seconds, a vacuum in time. Then a single person began to clap. It was Marcus Thorne. He was on his feet, his applause not polite, but loud, resonant, and full of genuine emotion. His action broke the spell. A split second later, the entire restaurant erupted. It wasn't just applause, it was a roar. People were standing, some were whistling, others were wiping tears from their eyes. The staff, her colleagues, were applauding, the loudest, their faces beaming with vicarious triumph. Mr. Dubois just stood there, his jaw agape, looking at Elara as if seeing her for the first time. Elara stood on the dais, her chest heaving, the adrenaline slowly beginning to recede, leaving a trembling in its wake. She had done it. She had let the monster out of the cage, and instead of devouring her, it had sung. Her eyes, however, were locked on the frozen tableau at table 7. Seraphina's phone had long since dropped to her lap, her mouth hanging open in a caricature of shock. Julian looked pale, as if he'd been physically struck. Beatrice's face was a storm of conflicting emotions, rage, humiliation, but also a sliver of something that looked like grudging awe. Richard Vandermeer was the most composed, but his eyes were narrowed, his mind clearly racing, processing this new, unexpected variable in his perfectly ordered world. Their power built on intimidation and status had been rendered useless by a song. They were the ones who were now background noise. Before the applause had even begun to die down, Marcus Thorne was striding towards the dais, weaving through the tables with a purpose that parted the crowd. He reached the stage and, without a word, enveloped a trembling Elara in a huge fatherly hug. "Elara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, right next to her ear so only she could hear. "It really is you. My God, kiddo, your father. He would be so, so proud." Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back finally streamed down Elara's face. To hear her father's name spoken with such love, to be seen not as a waitress, but as David Vance's daughter, broke through the last of her defenses. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't know you were here." "I've been looking for you and your mother for years," he said, pulling back to look at her, his hands on her shoulders. "You disappeared." "Why didn't you call me? We lost everything," she said, simply the shame returning. She wasn't well. We just..." "Shh," he interrupted gently. "We'll talk about all that later. What matters is now. What you just did. That wasn't just a song, Elara. That was a testimony. And that voice, it's a weapon." He turned to face the still applauding room. He raised a hand, and the crowd quieted, eager to hear what the legendary producer had to say. "For those of you who don't know," Marcus announced, his powerful voice filling the room, his arm still protectively around Elara's shoulders. "This is Elara Vance, and the music you just heard was composed by her late father, David Vance, one of the most brilliant composers I ever knew." A murmur went through the crowd. The name Vance still held weight in certain circles. Marcus then turned his gaze, letting it sweep slowly across the room until it landed with deliberate, chilling precision on table 7. He didn't name them. He didn't have to. Everyone had seen the preceding drama. "True talent, true art," he continued, his voice dropping to a steely, serious tone, "is born from passion and truth. It's not something you can buy or bully or intimidate. It's something that has to be nurtured and respected. It's something that people with no soul," he paused, letting the words hang in the air, "can never truly understand." The jab was surgical. Richard Vandermeer's face tightened, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Beatrice looked as if she had swallowed poison. Marcus turned his back on them, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and focused entirely on Ilara. "Ilara Vance," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "I was in this restaurant tonight for a business meeting to discuss the launch of a new record label, Soundverse Media. I was looking for a flagship artist, someone with a real story, a real voice." He smiled, a wide, genuine grin that lit up his face. "I believe I've just found her." "How would you like a recording contract?" The room gasped. This was not just praise. This was a life being changed in front of their very eyes. Ilara stared at him, speechless. A recording contract. The dream she had buried so deep she'd forgotten it existed. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say yes," Marcus urged, his eyes twinkling. "Say you'll come to my office tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. and my lawyers will have a contract ready that will make sure you and your mother are taken care of for the rest of your lives." The tears flowed freely now, but they were tears of disbelief and joy. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, of course, yes." Another wave of applause, even more thunderous than the first, swept the room. It was a fairy tale ending, playing out in real time. But at table 7, the story was a tragedy. Richard Vandermeer stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. He threw his napkin down on the table. The deal he was there to secure with Marcus Thorne, the Soundverse Media deal, had just been detonated. Not only had he lost the deal, but he had lost it to the very girl he had tried to destroy. The public humiliation was total. "We're leaving," he snarled to his family. Beatrice, Serafina, and Julian rose silently, their faces flushed with shame and fury. They couldn't get out of the restaurant fast enough. As they made their walk of shame towards the exit, no one made way for them. They were forced to navigate around people still applauding for Ilara, their former power and prestige utterly evaporated. As Julian passed the dais, his eyes met Ilara's. In them she saw not just anger, but a sliver of something else, confusion. He was the one who had inherited his father's cutthroat instincts, but he'd just witnessed a power that money couldn't buy, and a strength that force couldn't crush. For the first time, a seed of doubt about the world his father had built was planted in his mind. Ilara watched them go, not with triumph, but with a sense of profound seismic change. She had found her voice again, and she had a feeling its first job would be to uncover the truth of why she'd been forced to lose it in the first place. The connection between the Vandermeers' cruelty and her family's downfall felt too strong to be a coincidence. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Ilara. True to his word, Marcus Thorne had a multi-album contract waiting for her. It was generous beyond her wildest dreams, with an advance that immediately lifted the crushing weight of her mother's medical bills and their precarious living situation. The first thing she did was move her mother from a cramped, dreary clinic to a top-tier private respiratory hospital, where a team of specialists immediately took over her care. For the first time in years, Ilara saw genuine hope in her mother's eyes. Her story became a local sensation. Serafina's video of the singing waitress, intended to humiliate Ilara, had backfired spectacularly. It went viral, but the hero of the story was Ilara, and the villains were the Vandermeers. The comments were brutal, decrying their arrogance and celebrating Ilara's talent. The Aria Grandeur was inundated with reservation requests from people hoping to catch a glimpse of the now famous Dias. Mr. Dubois, deeply apologetic, had offered her job back with a promotion which Ilara politely declined. Her waitressing days were over. Ilara spent her time in a state-of-the-art recording studio with Marcus, surrounded by the best session musicians in the country. The music flowed out of her. She finished her father's compositions, wrote new songs, and poured all the pain and struggle of the past 5 years into her art. Marcus guided her, but he was careful to let her voice, her story, remain the centerpiece. "Your power is in your authenticity," he told her during one session. "Don't ever polish it away." During a late-night coffee break, Ilara finally asked the question that had been haunting her. "Marcus, my father's catalogue. Who took it? I only know he signed a deal with some investment group that bled him dry and then seized all his rights when he couldn't pay them back." Marcus's face grew grim. "It was a shell corporation, Ilara. Utterly ruthless. They found a loophole in his contract, something about delivery dates, and leveraged it to ruin him. I tried to help, but by the time I found out it was too late. The company was called Phoenix Holdings, an anonymous predatory firm. I could never pierce the veil to see who was behind it." The name meant nothing to Ilara, but she filed it away. Meanwhile, in the cold, opulent silence of the Vandermeer mansion, the family was imploding. The viral video and the subsequent news articles had made them social pariahs. Invitations to galas were rescinded. Friends suddenly stopped returning their calls. Beatrice's perch atop the social ladder had crumbled, leaving her bitter and furious. But the real damage was happening in the world of Richard Vandermeer. The story of his public humiliation at the hands of a waitress he'd tried to fire painted him not as a titan, but as a petty bully. Whispers started in boardrooms. Competitors saw weakness. The Soundverse media deal had been a cornerstone of his new expansion plan, and its spectacular failure, coupled with Marcus Thorne's public rebuke, had spooked investors. The stock of Vandermeer Consolidated took a significant hit. Julian was the most deeply affected. The incident had shaken him. He had been raised to believe that wealth and power were the ultimate arbiters of value. But Ilara's song had demonstrated a different kind of power, one that his father's billions couldn't touch. Haunted by the memory and by the look of confusion and recognition he'd seen between Marcus Thorne and Ilara, he began to do something he had never done before: question his father. His curiosity led him to the private server in his father's home office. He was looking for files on Marcus Thorne, trying to understand the history there. But a different keyword search yielded a far more explosive result. On a whim, he typed in the name David Vance. A single, heavily encrypted folder appeared. It took him 2 days to bypass the security, but when he finally opened it, his blood ran cold. The folder was labeled Phoenix Holdings. Inside were all the documents from the deal that had ruined Ilara's father. The predatory contracts, the internal memos outlining the strategy to leverage the artist's financial instability, and the final acquisition papers signing over the entire David Vance musical catalogue to Phoenix Holdings for a pittance. And at the bottom of the final directive, a digital signature, Richard Vandermeer. The truth was sickeningly clear. The Shell Corporation wasn't anonymous at all. It was his father. Richard Vandermeer hadn't just been a random, cruel patron that night. He was the architect of the Vance family's destruction. He had come to the restaurant to make a deal with Marcus Thorne to launch a music label, a label he intended to build on the foundation of the very music he had stolen from Marcus's best friend. The staggering, monstrous audacity of it left Julian breathless. His father's cruelty at the restaurant hadn't been random. It was the arrogance of a predator who believed his victim's child was so insignificant, so far beneath him, that he could mock her to her face without any fear of consequence. He didn't even recognize her. She was just another piece of background noise in the world he owned. Holding the tablet displaying the damning evidence, Julian felt the gilded floor of his life fall away. His father wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was a thief, a monster who had built a part of his empire on the grave of a brilliant artist, and then tried to snuff out the last remaining ember of that artist's legacy, his daughter. He walked out of the office, the tablet in his hand, like a stone slab of judgment, and went to find his father. Richard Vandermeer stood in his study, a cavernous chamber of mahogany and aged leather that smelled of old money and ambition. It was less an office, and more a mausoleum of his triumphs, the walls lined with framed magazine covers and lucite trophies celebrating his ruthless business acumen. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch, the amber liquid catching the light as he stared grimly at a monitor displaying the cascading red numbers of his company's stock. For the first time in his life, he was a king presiding over a crumbling map, and the tremors were coming from within his own castle walls. The heavy oak doors opened without a preceding knock. Julian entered his posture, rigid his face, a mask of cold fury. He didn't carry the lazy, entitled air of the heir apparent anymore. He moved with the grim purpose of an executioner. In his hand, he held a tablet, its screen glowing ominously in the dim light. Richard looked up, his irritation barely concealed. "I'm busy, Julian. Whatever it is, it can wait." "No," Julian said, his voice flat and hard, a tone he had never used with his father before. "It can't." He strode to the massive desk and placed the tablet down, spinning it to face his father. On the screen was the master contract from Phoenix Holdings for the acquisition of the complete David Vance musical catalogue. Richard's name was starkly visible on the signature line. A flicker of surprise, quickly suppressed, was the only crack in Richard's iron facade. He calmly placed his scotch on a leather coaster, the soft click echoing in the tense silence. "Your mother taught you it was rude to go through a man's private files." "And you taught me to look for leverage." Julian shot back, his voice seething with a disgust that had been simmering for days. "Phoenix Holdings. It was you. All this time, you were the corporate predator, the ghost that ruined that family." Richard leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, a slow, condescending smile forming on his lips. He wasn't ashamed. He was appraising his son's newfound spine. "So you found an old business deal. Congratulations." David Vance was a sentimental artist, not a businessman. He was drowning in debt and signed a contract he didn't understand. I simply collected on his incompetence. I saw value, and I took it. That is the foundation of this family, Julian. It's the lesson I have spent your entire life trying to teach you. The strong survive, the predators eat, and the sentimental fools become footnotes. Footnotes. Julian's laugh was a bitter, broken thing. You destroyed a man's life, you orphaned his daughter, and then years later you sat at a table and let us mock her for being poor, for being exactly what you made her. Was that part of the lesson, too? The sheer sociopathic arrogance of it all. Did you feel powerful watching her serve you wine, knowing you owned her father's soul? She was nobody. Richard snarled, his composure finally breaking. A ghost in a uniform. My only mistake was not ensuring she remained one. That's where you're wrong, Julian said, leaning forward, his hands flat on the polished desk. Your mistake was believing your money made you invincible. You thought you owned the world, but you couldn't even own a single room when she started to sing. I saw your face. I saw everyone's face. All your power, all your billions, couldn't buy you an ounce of the respect she earned with one song, a song built on the pain you caused. Richard stood, his towering frame exuding menace. This sudden burst of morality is pathetic, Julian. Where was this conscience when you were driving the Ferrari I bought you, or when you were spending your trust fund on meaningless trifles. You are a Vandermeer. You benefited from this world, so don't you dare stand there and pretend you're a saint. I'm not. But I'm also not you, Julian said, his voice dropping now laced with a chilling finality. And I won't be. You're going to fix this. You will sign over the entire David Vance catalogue to its rightful owner, Ilara Vance. All of it. No strings, no clauses. Richard scoffed. You're in no position to demand anything. Aren't I? Julian picked up the tablet. This folder contains every predatory memo, every ruthless email. I will send it to Marcus Thorne. I will leak it to the Wall Street Journal. Your investors are already spooked. Imagine what happens when they find out the great Richard Vandermeer doesn't just crush his competition, he preys on grieving artists. Your reputation will be incinerated. Your legacy will be that of a common thief. The father stared at the son, truly seeing the stranger before him. He saw not a petulant boy, but a man who had drawn a line in the sand, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that Julian would follow through. The battle was already lost. Weeks later, Ilara was in the studio working with Marcus on the final mix for her album. A courier delivered a thick, unassuming legal envelope. She opened it curiously, pulling out a dense stack of papers. As she read the title, Deed of Copyright Assignment and Reversion, her brow furrowed in confusion. Marcus took the documents from her trembling hands. His eyes, trained by decades of reading contracts, scanned the pages rapidly. His jaw grew tighter with every paragraph. My God, he whispered, looking up at Ilara, his face a mixture of shock and awe. It's the catalogue, all of it. Your father's entire life's work. He gave it back. He who? Ilara asked, her heart pounding. Richard Vandermeer, Marcus said, pointing to the signature. He signed it all back over to you, unconditionally. You own everything. The words didn't seem real. Ilara sank into a nearby chair, the sterile air of the studio suddenly feeling sacred. It wasn't just about the money or the rights. It was about justice. It was her father's name, his art, his legacy, finally returned from its captivity. A deep, shuddering sob of relief escaped her, a sound that carried 5 years of grief, struggle, and silent yearning. It was the final cleansing note of her long lament. Her debut album, The Background Noise, was released 2 months later, to universal acclaim. Critics lauded it as a masterpiece of narrative songwriting, a seamless blend of a father's classical genius and a daughter's modern soulful fire. The title track became an anthem for underdogs everywhere. The album didn't just climb the charts, it dominated them. For every step, Ilara ascended into the light. The Vandermeers descended further into darkness. Julian officially resigned from Vandermeer Consolidated and used his personal funds to start a small ethical tech incubator, severing all ties with his family. His departure triggered a vote of no confidence from the board, and Richard Vandermeer was unceremoniously ousted as CEO of the company he had built. He remained a king, but his kingdom was now just a lonely mansion, filled with bitter memories, and a wife who could no longer stand the sight of him. The final scene of Ilara's journey unfolded 6 months later. The stage was not a restaurant dais, but the hallowed ground of Carnegie Hall. Every seat was filled. A single spotlight found her at a magnificent Steinway grand piano. The roar of the crowd was deafening. She waited for the applause to fade, a serene smile on her face. There was a time when I believed my voice was meant to be a secret, she said, her voice warm and clear, carrying to the furthest balcony. I thought it was a burden, a memory of a life I had lost. But I learned that our stories, especially the painful ones, are not meant to be silenced. They are meant to be sung. She paused, looking out at the thousands of expectant faces. This song is proof that a legacy is not just something you inherit. It's something you fight for, something you reclaim. This is for my father, David Vance, and it is for anyone out there who has ever been made to feel like background noise. Listen closely. Your song is about to begin. Her fingers found the keys, and the opening notes of her father's unfinished symphony, now complete. Now hers, now theirs, filled the legendary hall. The ghost of aria grandeur was gone forever. In her place stood an artist, a warrior and a legacy reborn, her voice, a final triumphant note of justice echoing into the night. Ilara's story is a powerful reminder that there is incredible strength hidden inside every one of us, no matter how overlooked we may feel. It shows us that dignity can't be taken, only surrendered, and that a single act of courage can change everything. Have you ever had a moment where you felt invisible? Have you ever witnessed someone being unfairly judged? Share your story in the comments below. We believe that sharing these experiences helps us all feel a little more seen. If Ilara's triumph resonated with you, please give this video a like to show your support. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message of resilience, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that inspire and empower. Your voice matters here too. Thank you for listening.